Hi, it's Elizabeth Willets here from Investing in Women, and I am absolutely delighted because today I am being joined by Tom Stenner-Evans from Thrive Law. We're going to be talking all about flexible working and what are your legal rights to flexible working and what are your obligations as an employer. So as people are logging on, if you could let us know if you can hear us all okay in the comments, give us a like, give us an emoji, and just let us know that you're here. But yeah, it's Elizabeth Willets here from Investing in Women, and I am delighted because I'm with Tom Stenner-Evans from Thrive Law, one of the leading employment law firms based in Yorkshire, where I'm from. So I'm quite excited. I'm going to be talking all about your legal rights to flexible working and your obligations as an employer. So hi, Tom. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm so excited to learn about flexible working and what our rights are, because it's quite an interesting subject, and it's obviously very vast and it's fast moving. Things are changing all the time. So, do you want to talk us a bit about why you were interested in delivering this presentation and what particularly interests you about flexible working?
Of course. And firstly, thank you, Liz. Good morning. Nice to see you again. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who's logged in today, who's given up their time to watch us talk. Why flexible working? I've been an employment lawyer for pushing 15 years, and flexible working is one of the areas which I think causes the most contention between employers and employees. It's obviously very close to home. Traditionally, it was working mums, perhaps people who had caring responsibilities. And often people are making those requests because they find themselves in a difficult situation trying to balance work and leisure life. So we've dealt with hundreds of cases over the years on both sides. It's also one of the areas where good communication and a positive culture can make a huge difference. And hopefully we can talk about that some today.
Yeah.
And thirdly, obviously, this is particularly topical. We've had people working from home or working remotely for 15, 16 months. It comes quite timely the day after the Prime Minister announced that the expectation is that people will return to work from the 19th of July onwards. So it seems like quite a good time to be talking about this.
I think a really good time.
Issue.
Yeah, I think some people will obviously be quite happy to go back to the office. Other people might have concerns. And obviously, hi, Mohammed. Thank you for joining us. Yes, some people have concerns. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting day to do it. So do you want to talk us through what is flexible working to begin with? Because it can mean anything, can't it? Well, I think it can mean anything, but what's the legal definition?
Yeah, so flexible working does get mashed up a little bit in how people define it. But I think also there is a misconception that flexible working is part-time working or working from home, and then anything else is not flexible. And that's perhaps some of the most common examples of it, but it's a lot broader than that. So the specific legislation which is set out in the Employment Rights Act, Section 80, capital F, says that you can request as part of flexible work a change to the hours that you work, to the times you're required to work, or a change to the place of work.
Okay.
Now that captures everything, really. It captures a change of office space, working from home, working from somewhere else, compressed hours, annualized hours, all sorts of things, part-time hours. So perhaps a good way to look at it is flexible working is anything which is not the accepted norm for your workplace. And that isn't that the accepted norm is office 9 to 5. If you're a milkman, you might work from 4 in the morning till 10. So those are your standard hours. Flexible working is something which departs from that.
Yeah. Good. Okay. And I can see people, I don't know if you can see the comments, but people are logging on and saying hello from LinkedIn. So we've got Annabelle and Deborah. So hi, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. So who then is eligible for flexible working?
Well, yeah, that's also a timely question, because as we speak, there's consultation ongoing and proposals to extend it to all employees, which we can come back to that in a minute as to why I think that's a good thing. At the moment, you have to be an employee. You have to have been employed for at least 6 months.
Okay.
At that point, you can make a formal statutory flexible working request under the legislation. Historically, it was limited to people who had care responsibilities or children, but they extended that. But at the moment, it's not available to everyone from day one. So you have to have done 6 months worth of service to be able to put in a request. Now, it's difficult to see why that's required. Potentially, it's linked to the same period of time broadly needed to get maternity leave, but of course, not all flexible working requests are from working mothers, so that doesn't necessarily make sense. Now, if you had it as a day one right for everyone to be able to make a flexible working request, I think you would get better transparency and better communication from day one. And this will be obviously very relevant to your business, Liz. There are a lot of exceptional candidates out there who, for whatever reason, don't want to work full-time hours.
Yeah.
But they might take a job because it's a great job and think, well, I can make it work for 6 months somehow. I can juggle childcare, I can juggle responsibilities, I can make personal sacrifices, etc. Whereas 6 months in, or 6 months and a day, in goes a flexible working request. Well, would it have not been better for the relationship and better for the communication to be able to say from the outset, yes, I'm really interested in this role, but I would like it to be on a flexible working basis, so that everyone knows where they stand, and that the people looking for that sort of working pattern can be upfront, and the employers who feel they can or can't accommodate that can be upfront from the outset. To me, that would get things off on a better starting point.
Yeah, maybe I'm just thinking from the employer perspective, maybe they're thinking it's linked to a probation period if they have a 6 month probation period.
Yes, potentially, but if you can do your job successfully, let's say 2 or 3 days a week, then the probationary period still applies.
Yeah.
And it might be that just having that level of communication at the outset just benefits everyone. To say, look, I'm really looking for a home working role. I can bring a lot of skills, but I live 2 hours away. It's too far for me to do it. Would you entertain that? And if the employer says no because of certain reasons, then fine, okay. Or if they say, well, we'd like to see you in the workplace for a period of time first to see how you sort of gel with the team, then at least you're having transparent discussions at the outset, and you're moving away from this us and them mentality, which has really risen its head a lot in flexible working. It always comes across like it's the employer versus the employee. That one wants something, one wants something else, and then they butt heads in the middle. And ultimately, and you may not expect lawyers to say this, really the only people who benefit from litigation are lawyers. It's stressful, it's expensive, it damages relationships. Good lawyers should be trying to help their clients avoid as much of that as possible.
Oh, sorry, let me knock this off. Someone said he's speaking from David. Sorry, it says he's speaking with the employer perspective. What about international remote work? Technology allows to work from anywhere, but how to manage? I'm not aware of foreign tax and social security. So I don't know. Let me knock this off.
Thank you, David. We've had a few people actually mention this question, and I spent a bit of time looking at it yesterday because now people can work remotely from other jurisdictions. I think the first thing that I've seen come up is the sort of time zone issue around client needs. Fine, but let's assume you want to work from Portugal, which I think is the same time zone as us. Well, that's no longer an issue. But David's right, and I can't speak to the tax issues because I'm not a tax lawyer or an accountant, but there are a number of considerations. If you want to allow employees to work abroad, you have got to factor in possible dual taxation. Employment rights are an issue. Now, generally speaking, if you're a UK employee, an English employee working for an English company, you just happen to be based abroad for a period of time, you probably retain enough of a connection over here to still qualify for English employment law rights. But that's not to say that you might not also pick up local rights as well. So what we advise employers is, if you're thinking about letting people work abroad, take local advice on the impact of that as well, and factor in the tax advice, the insurance advice, whether or not the jurisdiction that they want to work in is aligned with your company values. Let's say, for example, you're very pro-LGBTQ plus community support. Well, there are some jurisdictions that are not. So how do you feel about your employees working in those jurisdictions?
Yeah.
What local laws are there around tax and insurance, any sales embargoes if you operate an import-export business. There are so many different considerations that I don't think people have really thought about, that if you are looking to allow employees to work abroad, it's not quite as straightforward, and it does need a lot of advice.
It sounds quite
a long
complicated.
answer, but it's quite a
Yeah,
broad
you'd need
question.
to get a bit more advice.
Yeah,
Presumably.
definitely. It's quite a complex area, and legal jurisdiction around statutory and contractual employment rights is very complex and very messy, and needs to be looked at very specifically on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, David. So we've talked. So basically, anybody's eligible for a flexible working request. Might not necessarily be accepted, but you can put in the request once you've been working for 6 months. And flexible working covers anything other than your usual hours or your usual place of work.
Yeah, that's a pretty good sort of lay description of it. Yes, and,
very layman's.
No. But I think sometimes these things could just do with being simplified, if I'm honest, and that's absolutely right. If you're looking to depart from your normal working arrangement, it probably falls into this remit.
Yeah.
That's a good starting point.
I've got my notes here. That's why I keep looking. So you want to work flexibly. You've been working there for 6 months, and so how then do you put in a flexible working request? What's the step?
The first port of call is your employer's policy.
Okay.
Employers should have a flexible working policy in place, which sets out the process that you need to follow to submit your request. Now, you can do it informally, just to have a chat with your line manager to say, this is what I'd like to do. Is this something you can accommodate? Yeah. And sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that works, and it's really helpful, nice and straightforward. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, or if perhaps the policy requires something a bit more formal, then you would usually put it in writing. Mm-hmm. And I would always say to employees looking to put a request in, help the employer help you. Put in as much detail as you can about what you want, why you want it if possible, because that can bring it if you have, say, a protected characteristic, but also preempt what the employer might say and address what their concerns might be. So if you're working in a managerial role and you want to do, let's say, 2 days a week from home, well, in your request, look to address the point around team supervision, to say, whilst I'm working at home from those 2 days, I'm confident that the team can be supervised by someone else, or I'll still be available on the phone and on Teams, and I can schedule my formal team catch-ups on the days when I'm in the office. Yeah. So preempt those points and help the employer to understand why your request can be accommodated. Okay, so there's no special form you need to get from the government website or anything like that? No, there's nothing like that. In writing is best, and sometimes some very detailed policies will have a sort of a form that asks these questions to prompt this advice. That's not a bad idea. Yeah. Because it draws out as much information as possible at the start, but there's no requirement for it to be a specific form. Okay, good. So we talked about sort of top tips then to get it accepted. So you preempt the employer's concerns and you pop it in writing. So what reasons can an employer use to refuse a flexible working request, and how can they avoid a dispute? Yeah, well, going back to what we said at the start, the best way to avoid a dispute is to communicate better and more than you would expect you need to as an employer. You often see these processes handled where the request goes in, they hold a meeting, and an outcome letter is sent. It's a yes or a no. And if it's a no, it's a very impersonal process there. Mm-hmm. This is someone who feels the need or the desire to request a change to their working pattern, most likely for good reasons. And saying no will often create difficulties. So communicate more than you think you should. If you've ever read anything by John Cotter, who talks about change management, he says that one of the issues with any sort of change process is that people under-communicate by a value of 10. So 10 times more communication than you think is enough is probably the right amount, which seems like a lot, but it does make a difference. Okay. In terms of the reasons for rejecting it, this is one of the areas where it is actually very clearly enshrined in law. So there are 8 reasons
Okay.
which is the burden of additional costs, so i.e. it's just too expensive, an inability to reorganize work amongst existing staff, so lack of resources, an inability to recruit additional staff, perhaps to fill a gap, a detrimental impact on quality, so the quality of the work, or a detrimental impact on performance, that might be, let's say, sales target or the performance of the individual.
Okay.
A detrimental effect on the ability to meet customer demand. So that would be, for example, someone wants to compress their hours and doesn't want to work during the busiest time of the day. Then you might rely on that reason. Insufficient work for the periods the employee proposes to work. So if I go back to my milkman analogy, which actually I was thinking about this yesterday, and before using this analogy, I was trying to work out if there's a gender-neutral term for a milkman,
Milk
which I suppose
person.
is just a milk delivery person, I guess, which what I would have preferred to use, but I didn't have time to look it up.
No, that's all right. We know what you mean.
My apologies. Say your milkman wants to work from 8 in the morning until lunchtime. Well, the milk gets delivered first thing in the morning. There isn't work to be done
it's too late.
So there just isn't work at the time they want to work. Or a planned structural change to your business. So if you are proposing to make some changes, some restructuring, and you therefore can't accommodate flexible working or reduced hours, for example. Those are the only 8 reasons that you can rely on.
It sounds quite a lot of reasons.
Well, yes, it is, because they can mean different things to different people, can't they? So, for example, a detrimental impact on quality could mean the quality of the final product that's created if you work in luxury goods. It could mean the response time for professional services. It could mean the quality of your management support. So these things do cover most genuine reasons. Mm-hmm. What you will find is that too many employers will reject a request and they will just cut and paste those reasons.
Okay.
So they'll say, we can't accept it because of a detrimental impact on performance. Well, if you're receiving that doesn't tell you anything, does it? That tells you they don't think I can perform very well if I work from home.
Yeah.
So the employer should be investing time in saying, we think there'll be a detrimental impact on performance or a lack of cover or something like that. And these are the specific circumstances. We have X number of people in the team. If you change your pattern from A to B, this will be the knock-on effect on the rest of the team in terms of productivity, management experience, communications, etc., etc., etc. And that's bespoke to every organization. That's the sort of information which, when that's communicated back to an employee, they might be able to relate to. They might be able to say, oh, okay, I hadn't really considered it from that perspective.
Yeah, get it now.
But it might also get a dialogue going that says, well, okay, that's a fair point. If you work in a finance team, that me working from home or if I do 2 days a week, that's going to cause you problems at month end. And then that can get a dialogue going to say, well, how about if I do 2 days a week most weeks, but I'm available 4 days a week for month end because that's your busiest time. Then you can have a constructive discussion, hopefully to reach a compromise that works for everyone.
Yeah. And do employers have to respond to employees within a set time period?
Yeah, so they have to handle it reasonably, which is lawyers' favourite word, as you can imagine. But there's a 3-month time limit, and 3 months is just sort of backstop really to give people the opportunity to sort of press their employer if they're being a bit tardy. Now you can extend that by agreement, but 3 months is the deadline. I think generally speaking, these are handled quicker than that, and we would say to employers, handle them in a more timely fashion than that. If someone's put a request in because they want or need a change in their working pattern, why would you keep them waiting 6, 8, 10 weeks for that decision if you don't need to?
Mm-hmm.
Just comes back to the quality of communication.
And if they go over that time limit, is there any? Do you just keep chasing?
I mean, technically it's a breach, and there are some remedies available under the flexible working regulations. They're quite toothless, which we'll come to potentially. And I would, unless the employer is just failing to engage, then I think to keep the dialogue as constructive as possible, having a discussion, say, look, 3 months has now passed, you really do need to deal with this as a matter of urgency, you would hope would be enough. If you've got an employer who's just ignoring the whole thing, then you're probably going to end up in a litigious situation anyway. So the delay or the complete lack of consideration is going to give grounds to a claim under flexible working regulations.
Okay. So you've put in your request, it's been accepted. Maybe the employer still has some reservations, potentially. Maybe you have some reservations. So what do you think are the best ways to trial a new working pattern?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there. There's trial.
Okay.
Trial periods are so undervalued, and they're absolutely worth doing from both perspectives, because the employee may not know if this new pattern is going to work. If it's compressed hours over 4 days or 3 days or something like that, they might find that turns out to be a disaster. And a flexible working request results in a permanent change. So that's the starting position. But the parties can agree a trial period. And to me, it makes perfect sense to agree that trial, because everyone gets an opportunity to see if it works and to see if it needs tweaking slightly or if it's a complete disaster. So say you set up a 3 or 6 month trial period, for example, and it works really well then great, you can confirm it. But equally, if the employer has reservations and is thinking, look, we really don't think this is going to work as a part-time role or as a flexi working role or a job share or a working from home role, well, if you try it for a sensible period of time, and what's a sensible period of time is going to depend on the role itself, then you've got the evidence that you need to go back at the end of that trial period and say, look, your productivity dropped off 25% in the last X number of months, or you've had 5 client complaints, or your team are miserable, or who knows what. This is the hard data that we need to confirm our concerns that we discussed X number of months ago, that this is not a role which can be carried out with this flexible pattern. That's the evidence you need. You can produce that evidence to the individual and say, I'm sorry, we'd love to be able to accommodate it, but there's too much of an impact on our business. There's too much detrimental impact on quality or performance, something like that. And having that evidence is really key from the employer's perspective.
Yeah. And I assume you put it in something in writing if it was going to be a trial period with an end date. Yeah.
Definitely. So I think a key tip for employers is, and this often isn't the case, but more is more when it comes to the outcome letter. So when you've had your meetings and you've discussed the flexible working request, if you're saying no, or if you're saying yes, but on a trial basis, give some detail in that letter. Explain why it's on a trial period basis. You might say that we have certain reservations about it, but you're a valued member of the team. We absolutely embrace flexible working, but here are our slight reservations about it. Therefore, we'd like a trial period to keep an eye on the following metrics, just to make sure that they're not adversely impacted for a business of our nature during that trial period. We'll revisit it in, let's say, 6 months' time, have another discussion about it, and then see where we stand. Hopefully everything will be fine. You know, that's a positive discussion. That's a positive conversation about essentially saying we're not necessarily certain that this will work.
Yeah.
But you would hope that that's going to get buy-in from the employee, who's going to understand that there has to be some business consideration alongside it, and that it's not just an unfettered right to work how and where people want.
Someone's asked if this is going to be available on a replay after, and yes, it's going to be on replay on my they've asked on LinkedIn, on my LinkedIn profile, so you can watch it after. Okay, and how do you think you can ensure flexible working is a success, a new working pattern's a success?
I don't think you can.
Okay.
I don't think you can ensure it will be a success. There will be times when it just doesn't work. I think we've got to be mindful of that. Now, people have worked at home for the last 15, 16 months, and that's great data as to whether or not a role can succeed from home or not. And the hope is, the only slight silver linings from a pandemic is that employees can demonstrate now that they can be trusted to work as opposed to having to be overseen, which I think is a really good thing. But also that employers will start to realize that they can succeed without having people sat in the workplace all of the time. But ultimately, it will or won't succeed depending on the role. Now, what the parties can do, I think, is to be mindful of the challenges that the change might bring,
Okay.
to address those head on. If that's, let's say, for example, a job share. So I watched one of your talks, I think it was last week, with the job share pair, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought it was fascinating. If that's been recorded, then everyone should look for that one.
Yeah, it has been recorded. Thank you.
It was really good. Liz didn't ask me to say that, by the way.
No, I didn't. Thank you.
But actually, it just got me thinking what opportunities there would be for people with a pre-prepared job share package to go to employers and say, look, this is what we can do as a job share to fill your full-time requirements. I thought that was great. But that links to your question here as to what people can do to make sure it succeeds. And that is to anticipate what the problems might be. So in that example, if you were saying, there are two of us here, we'd like to job share your HR director role. Well, the obvious question there is, what about the transition? Like, how are you going to ensure some continuity of work? So I think you say, well, we will dedicate 1 hour each or 2 hours each or half a day each of our time to communicating and handing over so that we're going to address those problems. So perhaps the broader answer to your question is to preempt those problems and to work out what you need to do to avoid them. If that's handover problems, if it's communication problems, put those things in place from the outset, keep an open dialogue going, and from the employee's perspective, be willing to accept if things aren't going perhaps as well as you would have liked, and say, look, this isn't going quite as well as I would have liked. I feel a bit disconnected from the team. Can we do X, Y, and Z to help me reconnect?
Yeah.
And equally for the employer to say early on that one area of concern is around our data security if you're working from home, let's say. So let's talk about putting some processes in place, or let's talk about making sure that you have full access to our cloud system so that everything's available in real time, something like that. But I think it all comes down to good quality communication and proactivity from both parties, which I think you could lift from flexible working and put into any aspect of the employer relationship. If you're doing a redundancy situation or anything like that, like proactive communication and openness makes a huge difference. And it demonstrates that both parties want it to work. I mean, sadly, you will often get the case where one party wants it to work and the other one really doesn't. And in those circumstances, if you feel that the employer really doesn't want to make it work and you just get that feeling, then I do think that either you have a frank conversation or you start to consider, is this the right organization for me? If they are not interested in helping this succeed, how does that align with my own values? The hope is that that's not going to happen that often, because employers will either say no if they genuinely feel they can't, or they will say yes with an open mind for how it can work and not how can we demonstrate that it won't. But that does happen, and there are employers who will be looking for it to fail.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't necessarily think that benefits everyone. I think an open mind to a trial period is the best approach. If it fails, well, there we are. You were right at the outset. If it succeeds, then it succeeds. You've got nothing to worry about. It's sort of win-win, isn't it, from the employer's perspective?
Definitely. So why do you think there is so much reluctance to embrace flexible working in some sectors?
Good question. I think it comes down to the difference between trust and control.
Okay.
And there are, it's very easy to say that you trust your people. But if you trust your people, you don't need to know where they are or what they're doing or when they log on. You trust the outputs will be delivered, that the quality of service will be maintained. That's trust. It's not trust if you need to know that they were still at their desk at 5:30, or if you need to oversee the way that they're working, or if you need someone there all the time because you're just worried about the client relationships if there's more than one person handling it. That's not trust, that's control. And there are a lot of sectors, I think, who are reluctant to relinquish that control. There's been, I suppose, historically a sort of master-servant style relationship where less senior people do what they're told and they've worked hard and they produce, and that's the end of it. But I've got clients and contacts who work in all sectors, manufacturing, retail, professional services, and the ones who've been really successful have empowered their people to do their job well. And if they don't do their job well, then there are obvious consequences in terms of performance management, things like that. But they trust them and say, look, you're experienced in your job. We trust you to do it well. And we want you to feel like you're empowered to do it well. And if you empower people, then you bring the best out of them. So I think that reluctance to move away from that is a factor.
Mm-hmm.
Another key driver, which I think will apply in a number of sectors, professional firms, recruitment, sales, maybe even property agency as well, is where you have people who are selling.
Yeah.
Because let's say, for example, you pay your senior salesperson £50,000 a year, full-time equivalent, okay? And that £50,000 brings with it a full-time sales or income or fee target of, for ease of maths, 500,000, okay? The employer is getting 10 times return on investment for that person on a full-time basis.
Yeah.
What happens if you drop to part-time working? The employer saves £25,000 if that salesperson drops to 2.5 days. Okay, so they've made a £25,000 saving, fantastic. But what happens to that sales target? That sales target has to be prorated as well, because you can't treat them unfairly and say, no, half the hour is full target. That sales target gets prorated by the same percentage to 250,000. Now, all of a sudden, your part-time worker isn't saving you £25,000 in salary. They're costing you £225,000 in lost revenue.
Yeah.
Now, it's not that there's I don't think any of those 8 reasons really applies there. You can afford to do it. Now, you'd have to link it, I suppose, to performance. But you can see how heavily the deck is stacked against anyone in those sectors who wants to work less than full time, because of the return on investment that the employer loses out on. You know, it's the thick edge of the wedge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, job sharing is a good way around that.
Yeah.
Because you get 2 people on 25,000, each with a target of 250,000. The employer pays the same, generates the same, but you're embracing flexible working. They just might want someone to just drop to 2.5 days a week without filling that gap. But again, it comes back to that discussion, comes back to that consideration.
It's interesting.
I do think it's a big hurdle for some employers, though. If you're a relatively small business, so perhaps reduce those numbers a little bit, then losing 50% of your income from each of your staff is a massive deal. When you factor in profit margins, might be, who knows, perhaps 30% net profit. Well, you're eating into a lot of your profit there, and people need to be able to keep a sustainable business. If that business goes under, then maybe everyone loses their jobs. So there's a balance to be struck. But part of the discussion during the process could be to say, look, we're really going to struggle with this for financial reasons, but what we'd like to do is perhaps contemplate a job share.
Yeah.
So you might already have someone who's working 3 days a week, let's say, and someone wants to do 3 days a week or something. You could say, well, how about we speak with them and try to amalgamate the roles in some shape or form, or perhaps we go out and look for someone to fill the gap on a job share basis. Try to be proactive, try to come up with some alternative solutions that might work.
Claire has said on LinkedIn that, I don't know if you can see the comments, but she said, wouldn't a progressive employer think, I've got an additional 0.5 headcount opportunity to recruit a second part-time employee? Which is a really good point.
Yeah, Claire, they would. And that's the hope, isn't it? Now, I suppose that takes some time. It takes some time to recruit someone. It's not always that easy, particularly in the current market. I mean, it's hard to recruit good people, I guess. There's a lot of new opportunities coming out of the last year from what we're seeing. But I mean, so yes, there might be business reasons why perhaps that's difficult. Obviously, an extra person brings with it extra overheads, responsibilities, on costs, things like that. You've got to train someone up from new. If you've got a really strong performer, Claire, you might not want the unknown second person. You might just want to keep your really good person doing really good work for you. But I definitely think that's the sort of thing that should come up during the discussions. The employee could say, well, I'd like to drop to 2.5 days a week. Why don't you go out and recruit for 2.5 days a week? And I would say it's incumbent on the employer to demonstrate that they've tried that. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Sometimes it's hard to recruit people, but then they can just rely on that reason to say, we can't recruit someone to fill this gap. It's a gap that needs to be filled. But it's a bit risky to just say that. I don't know, show some evidence. I phone up some recruiters and say, I've got a 2.5 day a week sales job doing X, Y, and Z. Do you think we could fill this? And if they say, yeah, I've got 100 candidates for you, well, then you're going to struggle to reject that request, aren't you? If they say, no, not a chance, no one wants 2.5 days a week doing that, then you're going to struggle. But I mean, the hope is that a progressive employer, of course, is keeping a very open dialogue about this and is toing and froing and having these sorts of discussions and isn't just looking at it, having one meeting and sending a letter.
It's interesting because obviously I agree with you. If people drop hours, it seems unfair to keep full-time targets. But I'm a recruiter, so I've previously worked in agency, and what was quite interesting was the lady that I worked with that was part-time, so she worked 4 days a week. We were all full-time. That was before I had kids. She was the highest performer on our team by far, and she worked 4 days. So she had Wednesdays off, and she outperformed all of us by a long shot. And she was so productive on those 4 days she was in the office. She was like a machine. Like, she didn't chit chat. We were all in the kitchen gossiping. She didn't do any of that. So sometimes I think that I know part-time is so productive because people just get things done. So
yeah.
I think that is a point that necessarily you don't necessarily need to drop targets completely in line with ours. And I know another recruitment firm that's dropped down to 4 days a week. So everybody does 4 days a week and Fridays off. And they kept the targets the same. And obviously on paper, it probably looks a bit unfair, but he sort of said it's working. Everyone's just getting things done in those 4 days. People are quite happy to have the Fridays off, and Fridays, like he said, is a bit of a nothing day. People gossip and take long lunches. So, yeah.
No, that's had a lot of press in the last couple of years. There have been some organisations who've moved to a 4-day week, but essentially saying, look, it's sort of full-time work in 4 days because of the productivity angle. You're absolutely right. I think it's a good sign as well if businesses are doing that. And when the whole business decides they want to do that, then you're absolutely right. But where you'll have some pushback, and I'm surprised that you didn't in that case, is if your 4-day-a-week person is being paid 80% of salary and expected to do 100% of target.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's not only not fair, it's probably unlawful as well, I suspect. It's probably less favourable treatment for a part-time worker. And it just sucks as well, isn't it? No one's going to like that.
Yeah.
So that isn't going to be very popular. Where I think what was I going to say? Oh yeah. It'd be interesting to know if she outperformed everyone against a full-time target.
Well, yeah, because we were all full-time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and her billings were so much higher than all ours, and we were all full-time. And that was honestly because she just worked when she did her 4 days. She got in, she didn't really talk to us, which was fine. And she worked, and then she finished on time. She'd finished on time, a hard deadline to pick up her son from nursery. Went home, and she outperformed all of us and kept getting star performer of the year, etc. So I think I get what you're saying about the targets, but from someone that obviously champions flexible working, I think that part-time employees can often exceed employers' expectations as well, and what people can deliver in the hours when you're so focused.
Yeah, maybe the problem is that employers have expectations, isn't it? It's that bias. It's that unconscious bias that, she's not going to want to take on that large project because she's got kids at home. Well, why don't you ask and say that, this is a new project. It's pretty time sensitive. It's going to need some weekends and some evenings, but we'd really like you to be on board. How do you feel about it? Ask the question. There's an assumption often, isn't it, that the ones who work part-time or who do compressed hours are not as committed.
Mm-hmm.
And you're absolutely right. That isn't necessarily the case. Now, they may not be able to offer the same silly hours as some other people, but it doesn't mean that they're not as committed or that they won't perform just as well, if not better, whilst they're able to. but there's often just a lack of conversation. It's assumptions, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
I'm 38 and we've got a 2-year-old at home. So before that, I had no reason not to just work whatever hours were needed.
Yeah.
And, in most sectors, but in law in particular, if you work really, really hard, you succeed. You generate more fees, you generate more clients, you succeed. Same in recruitment, same in other things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm better at my job than someone who is working 3 or 4 days a week, or that I necessarily want to take on a project that runs into an evening.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I'm probably more able to do it. But I'd always advocate, ask the question. If someone's doing 3 days a week or something like that, ask the question. Say, look, completely understand if this doesn't fit into your working pattern, but you're amazing at this particular piece of work. We'd love you to get involved if you'd like to. That's a positive conversation.
Yeah.
That's a safe space for the individual to say, I'm sorry, but I can't, and not feel like saying no is detrimental to their career.
I have another question that wasn't included in our thing, which is the other side of the argument about young people joining the workplace and what it means for them and their training and development opportunities if so many more senior staff are working remotely. And I think that's an employer concern.
It is. And I think I like to think I've got quite a progressive attitude to this.
Yeah.
To this topic. Particularly as someone who historically is not your typical candidate for flexible working. But I do see this as an issue that's difficult to resolve because I remember the value of being around more experienced people, that sort of learning by osmosis, hearing the way they take client calls, hearing the way they engage with colleagues and clients, hear the way that they handle challenging exchanges. There are ways you can replicate that by getting juniors on to calls as well, but it's not as natural and it doesn't happen as organically. So I do think that in some areas, or even perhaps a lot of areas, that full-time distance between supervisors and juniors is a challenge. And for young people, or for people who are new into their career at probably any age really, not having that close learning environment, I think is going to be challenging. So I would definitely be saying to people, like, if there's an opportunity and if it works for you to spend some time with your managers, supervisors, seniors, do it because you'll learn more that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's perhaps the hardest balance to strike here, Liz. I think is how to set that up. Like, do you have a policy that says that we need like at least 2 days a week in the office, which feels rigid? But if you are looking at that policy, then have that policy explained to say, because we think the value of team interaction from a social and a morale basis and a learning and development basis and a supervisory basis is so significant that we think people should be there at the same time for X number of days or hours per week. That's that's taking a rigid policy for the sake of being rigid, and it's applying common sense reasons to why it's in everyone's interest.
Yeah. And obviously some firms are different, aren't they? Some firms, will recruit a lot of people straight from university, and others maybe a bit smaller and have more experienced staff. I think it's a case by case basis.
Yes, it is. I mean, we are fully remote at Thrive. So we have an office in Leeds and a small presence in London. I live in Devon. I live in Exeter. We have the team all around the country, and they can work wherever they want. And if they want to go into the office, then they can, but they don't have to. But Jodie, our managing partner, has put practices in place to make sure that we have very regular one-to-ones, we have catch-ups, we have meetings, so that people are still able to get that learning.
Yeah, still feel part of the company.
That someone like me can join a firm like Thrive, which is very much aligned to my values, even though I live 4.5 hours away from Leeds. That doesn't matter, because of the communication levels and the systems that we have in place. Now, that might not work for all organizations, I understand that. But if it could work for you as an organization, if you're nimble enough to put that in place, then what a great opportunity to steal a march on your competition, to attract the very best talent. Because the very best talent is not 50 hours a week, 5 days a week necessarily. A lot of the absolute best talent has other commitments, and you risk missing out on them if you don't create an environment that's conducive to flexible working.
You made a good point there, actually. Just going back to the recruitment company I was talking about that was doing 4 days a week and kept the targets the same and hadn't noticed a loss in productivity. They were paying staff still full-time pay for 4 days a week. So yeah, it's, you know, it might look tight initially in terms of you might worry about lost revenue, etc. as an employer, but if you sort of flip it around, you're a very, very suddenly a very attractive employer, and you're going to attract a lot of top talent that would be interested in working for an organisation like that.
Because you're different, because you're saying that we value the welfare of our people. We understand the importance of work-leisure balance. I always call it work-leisure balance, because I think work-life balance suggests that work is not an important or positive part of your life, and it should be. So I always say
work-leisure, I like that,
but it's, you know, it's progressive, and we're in an environment where the working practices have been shaken up, and the early adopters, the organizations who are saying, look, we've been doing this for a while, like, people can generate what we need them to generate doing 4 days a week, and they can rest, and if they're rested, they're happier, their cortisol levels are lower, they're more productive, they're happier, our staff turnover is significantly reduced. That works for us. Those businesses that are doing that or have been doing that, absolutely, that's a head start. Because if I worked in recruitment, not that I know much about recruitment, I'd think, wow, if these people trust me to do my job in 4 days a week, that's a good environment. I like that. I'm not there to get beasted until I've had enough, and then I leave, and then they bring in the next batch. You know, that's not inspiring, is it?
Claire on LinkedIn has a question for you. What feedback have you had from your paralegals who are working at home alone, perhaps those that are in a busy house share without home office? Thanks, Claire.
Well, I'm speaking for them now, Claire, and I think at least a couple of them are on the chat, so they will soon correct me if I get this wrong.
Correct.
I think, yeah, we've had positive feedback because Thrive, which is 3 years old, has always done this. So we haven't changed our working practices really much because of the pandemic. Yeah, people have had to be at home, but they were choosing to do that anyway. So I think it's less of a shock to the system, perhaps for our paralegals. We've just put in a new system of monthly one-to-ones instead of appraisals, because appraisals every 6 months is just too far apart for feedback. So now it's monthly, it's led by the paralegals. It's their opportunity to tell us what is going well and what isn't going well from their perspective. So nothing goes more than, say, 2 or 3 weeks without it being fixed and tweaked. But I can completely understand that if you're in a busy house share and you haven't got a home office, I mean, look, you know, I'm in our spare bedroom.
I'm in my dining room. I mean,
exactly. You know, I mean, there's usually a cat on this bed, but he's downstairs because my wife has the office upstairs. But it would be so hard in a house share with 3 or 4 other people. We haven't had, from what I can see, many of those challenges. I have seen a lot of junior lawyers posting about this, about the difficulties that they face. I just think it's incumbent on the employer, on the managers, to invest time in understanding everyone's specific situation. So this enforced home working has not been great for some people. Absolutely it hasn't. So take the time to understand that, to say, look, how have you found it? Look, what are your challenges? And if you need to work at a certain time of the day, how can we accommodate that? A proactive employer is having those conversations to say, look, tell us what works for you around your arrangements. If you have got, really bad internet, how can we help? How can we help upgrade it at no cost to you? How can we help you to do your job to the best of your ability? That's what keeps people there for 5, 10, 20 years, and what keeps the recruitment business quiet because you're not reaching out to replace people. And there's no substitute for making people feel happy and engaged and empowered at work at whatever level. Everyone should be allowed to come to work and enjoy their work, I think, as much as possible. And so few organizations really prioritize that. Really understand that people are the most important asset.
We had some questions beforehand on LinkedIn. So we've already had the tax question because we had a question about tax. So that's been answered. But Emmanuel, he had a question regarding employer obligations in regards to childcare. Do employers have any obligations if you have to leave work by a certain time to pick up children?
Well, childcare is an interesting one because, like I said at the start, childcare was one of the requirements for a flexible working application before, until they abolished that a few years ago. Now, the flexible working regulations, if your request is not handled properly, you can have claims under the flexible working regulations for a breach. That's capped at 8 weeks pay. So it's a sort of fairly toothless remedy. Where flexible working becomes high risk for employers, generally speaking, is because more women still statistically have childcare responsibilities than men.
Yeah.
It's changing, but that's still the case. So what that means is, in the eyes of the law, the requirement to work, for example, full-time, puts women at a disadvantage over men.
Yeah.
So if you have a policy that says we need people to work full-time, that disadvantages women. What that creates is an indirect sex discrimination claim, potentially, which has uncapped compensation. And I've seen these run into serious sums of money. So the childcare thing brings in that discrimination risk because more women need to leave early, or are the ones who have to go to the school if the child's ill. So the requirement to be at your desk 9 to 5, for example, is harder for women to comply with.
Mm-hmm.
So employers should always be mindful that if you are setting rigid hours, then there is that risk there in terms of indirect sex discrimination. There's also other legislation around emergency dependency leave, where employees are entitled to reasonable unpaid time off to deal with emergencies for dependents. Probably a good example of that is if the school phones and your child is ill and you have to go and get them, that needs to be actioned. That emergency has to be handled. The employee is entitled to reasonable time off to fix that issue without any detriment. So without having it held against them.
Yeah.
That kind of covers the sort of short-term childcare and the long-term childcare responsibilities. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that does. And then Emmanuel had another question, which is interesting. In the context of home working, do employers need to note, from a legal perspective, need to notify HR or their manager if they leave the house?
And that, well, comes back to trust and control, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, trust and control, and I suppose health and safety, potentially.
Okay.
Health and safety is another factor that goes into people working from home around insurance and risk and compliance. Employers have various duties under the health and safety legislation around safe working environments in terms of screens and setups, but also sort of general health and safety. It's a little bit outside of my remit, but always something to be mindful of. I think if you have an environment where someone leaves the house and it's a problem, then it comes back to that communication, doesn't it? I mean, you shouldn't have to inform your employer. Most people working from home are working in jobs with, I suppose, a fair amount of autonomy. Mm-hmm. So you shouldn't have to. But equally, you do have contracted working hours to adhere to.
Yeah.
And if you go out for a 3-hour gym and swim session at lunchtime and you're just not there, well, you wouldn't do that at work, would you?
Yeah, and you might risk losing the trust.
Yeah, so quite a lot of it is common sense, but I would definitely suggest, and I know I keep coming back to this, just having a dialogue that says, look, if you can't reach me at 11 o'clock, it's because I've just got to pop out to let the so-and-so in, or something like that. Just manage the expectations. So just keep your calendar updated. If you've got, if you need to pop to the shops at a certain time for a certain reason, who knows? And say I'm going to be out for 15 minutes here. Is that okay? It kind of comes down to the job and the environment. I guess as a partner in a law firm, then I've always had enough autonomy to be able to do those things. So it's going to be different for everyone. But again, it comes down to the employer's policy and the level of trust that's in place.
Who we're pleased to know, Deborah, that you work with, she's made a comment. She said she works from home as a paralegal at Thrive. She's created a good working environment for herself with a routine of walks, workouts, meditation around her working hours. If she ever feels like she needs a change, she can go into the office, but it really works for me. You have good communication, and so she never feels isolated.
This is something that we really major on. So if any of you don't follow Jodie Hill on social media, LinkedIn, and Instagram, then do, because her story is inspiring and her approach to being a law firm owner and partner is incredible.
Yeah.
She absolutely advocates mental well-being, physical well-being. We have sort of days that people can just take if they need to, for mental health days, no questions asked. And it's all about just what Deb says, like creating a structure that works for you. If you want to log on at 6 a.m. and work hard and then take a nice long lunch for a gym, fine. As long as the clients are happy, that's all that counts. Make it work for you. She's very, very proactive about using apps for mental health awareness, for tracking sort of team happiness, things like that, walking, workouts, meditation, yoga, all of these things are sort of enshrined in what we do. And we wouldn't take someone on who didn't value their own health and well-being and who therefore wouldn't value it in the rest of the team. That's a sort of a key thing for us, which is what Deb is saying, and it works, and it creates a harmonious team, a happy team, which is really all you can ask for.
Yeah. Good. So I know that we're coming up to the end of our session. So if anybody's got any last minute questions, then you should pop them in the chat. But I just thought I would finish by asking you, what do you think's next for flexible working?
Oh, well, yeah. So I think flexible working may well be extended to people from day one. But even if it's not, we are going to see a deluge of flexible working requests from people, I think, where their employer says, oh, okay, it's July 19th, now everyone, see you back in the office 5 days a week. Yeah. Some people will embrace that. But for a lot of people who aren't doing a long commute, even a short commute in London's an hour. Yeah. Each way, as you know, because you've worked there. That's a really good commute. That's if you're living somewhere very expensive.
Yeah.
And, it's like that commuting time and the challenge of childcare and balancing that and just that work-leisure balance, really. A lot of people aren't going to want to go back to the old norm. They'll have the opportunity to put in flexible working requests and say, well, I'd like to do X number of days from home. I'd like to do fewer days, compressed hours. Now, the difficulty is these people are going to be able to give a year and a half of data that says I can do my job really well from home. Look at my productivity. Look at my numbers. Look at the company's success. It's going to be much harder for employers to say no to flexible working requests, I think. Now, there'll still be cases where perhaps it's not suitable, obviously, but I think employers are going to find themselves even more on the back foot than they probably already were. And the biggest piece of advice that I would give to anyone employing is say, look, just get ahead of this curve. Just sit down and consult with your people about what they want. Do they want a hybrid model where you can work from home if you want, the office if you want, or a sort of half and half? Like, ask people what they like. Some people might just be desperate to get back to 5 days a week in the office. Some people might not be. You don't have to have a system that's the same for everyone. Just have something that works. Have something that works, talk to people, and just get ahead of this curve. You don't want to be firing out rejection letters for flexible working claims left, right, and centre. I in 15 years have seen one flexible working claim get to a tribunal and be successfully defended.
Just one.
And I've seen plenty lose. So the employee ones that I've done, I've never lost one.
Okay, so we'll all go to Tom if we have our flexible working.
Yeah, it's not meant to sound big-headed. If there's any other lawyers, I'll probably say the same. Any flexible working claim that I've run that's got to a final hearing, the only one that we got very near to, and we in fact settled before judgment, was looking like we were going to successfully, but that was very, very, very niche. Generally speaking, they're hard to defend. They're hard to defend without trialing, and just get ahead of the curve as employers. Yeah, even harder now if someone can say, well, here you go, you don't need a trial period, we've had 15 months of data, here it is for you, tell me why this won't work. And that just blows the relationship out of the water, which no one wants. That isn't good.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we've not had any more questions, so I think I've asked all mine. So thank you ever so much for your time, Tom. So where can people connect with you? Do you want to talk a bit? Just remind people where you work and how to find your details.
Yeah, so I'm a partner at Thrive Law. If you Google Thrive Law, you can find us pretty easily. We're a little niche boutique employment law, HR, and employee wellbeing firm. We like to think that we're a little bit different because of the approach that we take to it. So please do come and check us out. You can find us all on LinkedIn. Jodie Hill in particular, our managing partner. You can find me, the rest of our team, all of the Thrive Law, quite active on social media.
Yeah.
It's probably the best place to find us. We have lots of content, lots of events. We'd love to see you again.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thank you ever so much for your time, Tom. And thank you for everybody that's watched, everyone that's left comments. There'll be a replay on my LinkedIn profile and in our Facebook group. And I'm sure if anyone's got any questions afterwards, then we'll try and answer. So thank you ever so much. Thank you so much, Tom. See you soon. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye.